Roughly 2 weeks ago, I presented my endgame Poison Twisted Blades Rogue build to speedrun Nightmare Dungeons. This build was the perfect balance between speed and DPS, had very little survivability, but that is fine because all we wanted to really focus on was to power level our glyphs. So it was very effective at exactly that. However, I eventually realized that obviously I can't push with this build, so I decided to go back to the drawing board and come up with something different for higher tier dungeons. This new build focused a lot more on survivability, and I called it the Noxious Ice because it revolved around one of the aspects that allowed you to freeze your opponents if you had the Penitent Boot. This was very effective to control the enemies even more while maintaining a good amount of DPS. We also focused a lot more on survivability with extra rolls of armor percent on our gear pieces. But even this build was effective until, I'm going to say, roughly tier 85, give or take, but it still had a few issues with survivability against ranged opponents, so we needed either even more survivability or more crowd control. And the importance of CC became really obvious when we did the high damage, high stagger build against Uber Lilith, where in this case, the CC is used to stagger the boss, and then during the time that she is staggered, you deal as much damage as possible. So now we are applying the same concept where we're going to crowd control the enemies long enough for us to ideally kill them in a couple seconds, and that is today's build. So here's how this new build works. We basically use concealment to first drop our poison traps, which has no charge cooldown. This allows you to basically knock down the entire enemies that are not necessarily grouped up, and then we follow up with our usual combo of death trap and poison trap along with the poison imbuement to deal our damage. We have a relatively short window to deal our DPS because the enemies will go into unstoppable at some point, but we can rinse and repeat this combo to basically come back and do the exact same thing, right? So it does take a little bit of setting up to do. There is a little bit of downtime as well in this setup, but it works wonders to not take as much damage because the enemies are basically all crowd controlled right off the bat. There is also another aspect that we have fit in this build that you do not currently see on this run, which is the Frostbitten. So you have a couple different ways of getting to this point, but it really revolves around the Infiltrator aspect and the Shared Misery aspect. A few more things to note about this build. Now that we're using Concealment instead of Shadow Step, and this is our only source of Unstoppable, and the fact that we're using it offensively means you can be in a pretty bad spot really fast if you don't pull off the correct positioning in the beginning. But because I use the exposure passive along with the preparation specialization, you can obviously reset all your skills to get another charge of concealment and get out of danger, right? But if you don't manage to kill the enemies within the couple of seconds where they're fully crowd controlled and vulnerable, you find yourself sitting there for too long. In this specific example, I'm fighting enemies that have a 60% resistance to poison damage, which means I'm not dealing enough damage fast enough for my combo to work, so I have to sit there for too long and obviously will die. Next point I quickly want to talk about is obviously the type of Nightmare Dungeon you are going to select to push in higher tiers. Not all of them are made equally. I mentioned this before. For example, Blind Burrows and Shift the Ruins are fairly easy dungeons to push in, whereas some of the other ones I would usually not even consider doing. But with this build, I found that even some mid-tier dungeons, so I'm going to say between like 70 and 85, are a lot easier. So I find myself taking on a lot harder dungeons with, for example, Nightmare Portal or the Drifting Shade, and this is a lot safer, right? Because of the concealment or the infiltrator aspect, you have a lot more control on the battlefield, and it makes it easier to take on more of them. But if you're going to push for a tier 100 dungeon, it tends to be one of the easier ones, so it'll be interesting to see how this build progresses for not just the easy dungeons but for all the other ones, which ultimately I think is the goal, is to run basically all the dungeons at level 100 with any possible modifier, if that is even doable. Anyway, all that said, now let's go over the gear and the skills. And like all the other builds, I will obviously have a link in the description for you guys, and I'm not going to spend too much time on each gear piece because by now we kind of understand that we're stacking a lot of armor, and we're also stacking a lot of damage reduction as well as some life, or at least to some extent, right? For the helm, we still want the poison imbuement. I think is great here in some secondary stats because, again, I am working with a 6th Paragon board. Might not be needed, but I am trying to reuse the same board I did for the Uber Lilith build. So basically, I'm trying to not change as much, but we may realize at some point that 6 boards just isn't worth it in terms of the stats, okay? The chest piece is where we've made the modification on one of the aspects. This is where we're using the shared misery. This one is fantastic. However, it does come at a cost. I am not using the one that reduces the amount of damage we take from crowd-controlled enemies, because the reasoning around this is that they're either stunned, knocked down, or frozen, so they're not necessarily attacking you, right? We are also spreading our slow from our puncture, which means we can hopefully hit the ranged enemies to deal even less damage because of some of our Paragon points. This is where I decided to put the frostbitten aspect, right, which will work nicely with the penitent greaves, and so same kind of gloves. However, I'm now using a pair of gloves that does not have +4 to twisting blades. Instead, we have the chance of generating some primary resource on our lucky hits. Okay, so this is how I got around to not using the inner sight specialization. As for the pants, we went back to putting the disobedience on the pants. I know this is risky, but because I have such high armor, and with the potion for the extra 900 armor, and then when this is fully buffed, we have a pretty high amount of armor in general, and I find that besides, because we're crowd controlling enemies, still the goal is to kill them fast enough and then get out, right? So survivability is good, but no matter how much armor you get, if it were, let's say, on the amulet, it feels like you can still die to the like one shots from ranged attackers. So anyway, the reasoning or the test is for the time being on the pants. Penitent greaves, then we've got our imbuement aspect on our two-hand weapon that I had for the Uber Lilith build, and I'm still trying to work with that. I'm also trying to go back to the vulnerable, the emeralds, basically the gems, right, instead of the poison over time, the amethyst. So we'll see if that works, but I may tweak it a little bit more. Then I went back to using the increased attack speed on the amulet, which is the same as the Uber build once again. So you kind of see the concept. I want to deal as much damage as I can in the short period of time that they're crowd controlled, and then get out, right? So for the rings, also still lucky hit, crit chance, vulnerable damage, crit damage. One of them has imbued damage instead, which I would assume still just as good. So we have the infiltrator. So this is the aspect that allows you to use concealment, go place your poison traps, and then unleash your combo and then get out. We are also still using the bursting venoms. I was recently told apparently this is glitched or not working as intended. It's dealing more damage than it's supposed to. If that is the case, then okay, we're gonna have a big problem in the future, because obviously we are relying on this to deal enough damage. So we'll see how this gets changed in the future. As for our weapons, twisting blades on one of them, the stats kind of the same as before, and then we have now the one where we're dealing more damage to stunned enemies, because we are getting a stun from our grenades, which is with the exposure passive. And this is also why we're using the frostbitten and not the noxious ice anymore. See, noxious ice worked on the chill mechanic, which we get with the boots, whereas this is the second they're chilled, you have a chance to instantly freeze them. So you get to the freeze a little bit faster than if you were to use the noxious ice, okay? But for that one, the stats are also the same. Obviously, we dropped the Asherah's Conjar to try and fit an additional aspect on the blade. Now let's go over the skills. Not much has changed in here either. It's basically the same thing, except we've obviously now dropped the shadow step and the dash, which we don't use at all. We do have one in rapid gambits and one in trick attacks for even more crowd control early on when we daze them, which we do have with our twisting blades. Now we have the concealment. I strongly suggest that you use the subverting stealth so that you get 6 seconds of vulnerability, because we do not have the exploit glyph anymore. So we need to get the enemies vulnerable long enough for us to kill them. If you don't kill them within the 6 seconds, then you're stuck having to use your fundamental puncture to vulnerable each enemy, right? So that gets pretty complicated in a pack of mobs. As for the poison trap, same thing here. We also have a maxed out, or as much as possible, poison imbuement. We have our 3 points into frigid finesse, and then we have a pretty standard kind of passives here for the death trap along with innervation, and finally the exposure passive. And again, this is where I mentioned the stuns. So this is where we're getting our stun grenades to ideally freeze the enemy with the frostbitten aspect. And finally, here's the Paragon board. So again, a work in progress. I try to shuffle this around so that it works for more builds. I mentioned this before, so the same 3 first Paragon boards are the same. We did shift some points into more survivability instead of damage for the Uber Lilith build, right? So that's kind of the concept of reusing the same boards, but obviously we're having to focus a lot more on damage reduction glyphs, basically, sorry, not glyphs, but nodes. And then we are using the last 2 boards, which is the Tricks of the Trade. So we've moved this one to there, and then only the last board now would change depending on, let's say, Uber Lilith and pushing higher tier dungeons. Okay, so the last one is now Cheap Shot. There is a lot of survivability to be gained in here because of the damage reduction from slowed enemies, but as you can see with my stats, I'm not even getting the full benefit of these last nodes on my 6th board, which is why I'm saying perhaps working with the 6th board is just too complicated. But you do get an additional glyph, which is really good. So the glyphs that I'm using for this build right now is Bane for more poison damage. We then have Control for more damage to frozen or stunned enemies, chilled enemies, obviously working nicely with the Penitent Boots, as well as the other aspect that we've selected for the increased stunned damage. Then we have here the Turf. Down here we have Tracker, and then we've got Combat and Closer, which is pretty standard. So there you have it, guys. This is the build that I'm now using to try and push or complete as many Nightmare 100 dungeons. I will post some full runs for you guys in the coming days, so make sure to subscribe and hit the like button. Hopefully you have enjoyed this video. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Thank you so much, and I'll see you guys later.